This is the brand new 48 scale P-47 from MiniArt. No aftermarket, no scratch building, an honest review of the kit as it comes out of the box. You will see what was good, where I had issues, how I solved them, and what I honestly hated. Simply said, the ultimate kit review. Following the instructions, I removed the cockpit parts from the sprues and cleaned them up. Right out of the bat, I can say that the plastic is on the soft side. Probably this facilitates the creation of such fine detail. So far I detected a little bit of flash, and some parts like the base of the pilot seat legs are molded out of register, which in conjunction with the super tight tolerances created an issue. While I was trying to fine-tune the bases, I broke one of the legs. To fix this, I first glued the bases in the slots of the cockpit floor. Then I drilled them and the seat where I will later glue metal rods. Not much of an issue, but be careful when you're building yours. This to me is the epitome of detail that is totally unnecessary. It is never going to be seen, so just put a sturdy and secure attachment and be done with it. At this point I also mounted most of the cockpit floor details and the forward bulkhead. For ease of painting I left the control stick out of the equation. Links for the tools and materials I have used you can find in the description. The sidewalls are properly well detailed, and on top of that we get more details to glue on. The instructions suggest black color for all of these small extra pieces, so technically they can be painted separately and glued later. I chose to glue all the details and then paint the walls as a whole. Something I will probably remind you several times throughout this build: dry fit first and correct if necessary. Case in point, the sidewall to cockpit floor assembly is a good design, but way too tight. So I helped it a little bit with some sanding. Not too much of an effort, but makes life easier. And that's about as good of a detail as it gets from injection molding, I think. With so many parts going into small assemblies, I like to keep track of what has been detached from the sprues. Furthermore, in some areas we have options to choose from, like here on the tail wheel, so working with the instructions helps. This little thing is a pain to put together, but it looks very good once assembled. If you don't want to deal with it, there is an option that has a boot and less parts, I believe. The instrument panel shroud and its cockpit related surroundings come as one part with the windshield base and some real estate that is in front of it. How this will fit on the fuselage we will see later on, but for now I installed some parts, one of which was the base for the gun sight. The latter I left out as it will be in the way of the cockpit masking. The main gear base have more parts than some kits in their entirety. Gluing walls on their own results in a rather flimsy construction. But while the glue was still setting, I put this subassembly in the dedicated grooves on the top part of the wing. This made the expected difference and was enough to make things way sturdier. This design requires from the builder to execute the assembly as close to perfection as possible. Deviation in the construction can lead to difficulties with the wings assembly and later on with the gear strut positioning. The fit in this area is rather good. However, I must remind you that before committing to the glue I did my homework and checked the joints. Some might say that breaking the gear base in so many parts is an overkill. I would argue that this is a fair price to pay for the amount of surface detail we get in exchange. To my knowledge, it is the only way to overcome the limitations of injection molding. One thing that I did not like here was the tiny actuator sticking out in harm's way, and this will become a theme later on. The tail wheel well is represented by a single piece shell that fits nicely into position and it is therefore easy to install. After a quick layer of surface primer, I went on to apply the base colors. For the cockpit, my choice fell on MRP's bronze green. If for some reason you think this color is not suitable or does not represent the real color, well, feel free to tell me in the comment section. Now for something very important. I need your feedback. How do you like this out-of-the-box build review style? I have one more model that I'm going to present in this fashion, and depending on how you respond, I will continue to build new toolkits out of the box so you can get the hands-on experience about how the kit actually goes together and what can be achieved without modifications. In this regard, if you are a manufacturer who is not afraid of an objective deep dive into your kit, let me know. On the gear base, I used Synchromatte Yellow from a GSI Creos set of interior paints. Just like with the cockpit, I did not try to paint effects at this point. Just a simple overall paint application with the slight deviation that I was not forcing paint into all the crevices, leaving those a bit shadier. Time to start the visual effects application. First off, using Citadel Abaddon Black acrylic paint, very highly diluted in isopropanol, I applied forced shadows. On the side walls, where I had a lot of details grouped together, I applied this shadow layer more liberally. In this case, the details will be black anyways, so if nothing else, those will be easier to paint later on. The yellow gear bay details got the same treatment. Using light gold gray, I lightened the base colors and applied this mix in the flat areas as highlights. This might seem like a middle finger to those who spend countless hours looking for correct colors, but it is not. It is just a way to make things more interesting and will be toned down with the weathering to come. Additionally, when the cockpit is closed in the fuselage, it becomes a very dark place, so in such scenario, high contrast is something I like. With the airburst forced shadows, I covered most raised details and edges. To highlight those painted with bronze green, I used interior grey-green. I applied that paler color using a fine brush. On some details I picked out only the edges, while others with smaller surface area I covered entirely. This layer is what allows for the forced shadows layer to make sense. For the gear base, I made a mix of colors as I did not have anything to use right out of the bottle. I gave all a coat of gloss lacquer varnish and left it to cure properly. This protective coat will make the detail painting much easier and stress-free. The sidewall details first I covered with flat black acrylic paint. With the clear varnish underneath it, it was easy to come back and clean up any excess black paint using just a simple toothpick. After I painted the oxygen hose in olive drop color, I abandoned the detail painting for a while. Instead, I applied buff oil paint using the dry brushing technique. I haven't tried the new dedicated dry brushing paints, but of all others, oil paints are my favorite for this job. I came back to the detail painting, this time with a silver pencil of all things, only to color a few knobs and abandon it again in favor of putting down several decals. I will talk more extensively about the decals later on, but for now let's just say they are made by Cartograph. Some more knobs I painted with red paint, and on the fuse box I dry brushed it, which I think gave a good result. I don't think I would be able to paint those tiny specks in any other way. To create the sharper shadows on the black items, I used Tamiya's Black Panaline accent color. Once it reached its matte finish, I used a fine brush dumped in white spirit to remove the excess wash. Using a mixture of Starship Filth and Starship Base Sludge oil paints diluted in white spirit, I made my wash for the rest of the painted areas, both in the cockpit and the gear base. In some places I tried to be precise and achieve a pin wash effect, while in other places I applied it to full coverage so it can act as grime filter in addition to being a wash. After the application was complete, I waited for about half an hour and started removing the excess using Q-tips or a paintbrush for the more intricate spots. The pilot seat is one of the focal points in the cockpit, and the seat belts are the highlight of the seat, so I had to make them work. I have to say that the molded in seat belts are very well detailed. Both the belts and their hardware look in scale, and honestly I prefer them to manifold touch offerings. Starting with several coats of dry light matte acrylic paint, I applied the base layer. This paint is a bit thin for my taste and it requires a lot of layers to reach full coverage. To darken the shadow areas, I reached for the sepia watercolor pencil. Using a damp paintbrush, I took some pigment out of the pencil and applied it on the seat belt. After some blending and drying time, I was really happy with how it came out. The highlights I chose to create using the Scholar acrylic paint. It is very similar to the base color, but just the right amount lighter to blend in quite naturally. The belt buckles were a prime candidate for a nice and easy painting, or shall I say coloring, with the silver watercolor pencil. To create a visual separation between the belts and the seat, I used Tamiya's black accent color, which later I removed almost entirely. The goal here is to leave the wash only in the corner, so it can effectively look like minuscule hard shadow cast by the belt. Before the next weathering step, I applied a layer of flat varnish. This will unify the sheen of all products used so far and will provide the necessary base for what is coming next. And that would be additive bare metal chipping using the almighty silver watercolor pencil. That will be applied on the heavier traffic areas where one would expect paint to get damaged. On other places I will do some paint distress, you know, dings and scratches that did not go all the way through the paint but still left some evidence. That I did using light grey watercolor pencil. And that looks just about right to me. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Another important part of the cockpit is the instrument panel. Here we have a very well detailed piece with several decal options, of which I chose the fully colored one. The challenge is to line up the printed instrument faces with the physical details on the dashboard. To do this I used Mr. Mark Setter and Mark Softer. While Mark Softener does its job softening the decals, it is not that aggressive and allows manipulation. I took advantage of this and aligned the graphics. After I was happy with the result, I used the very aggressive Agama Hypersaw to make the decals sink in position. It goes without saying, do not touch the decals after the Hypersaw application. After a quick layer of flat varnish, I reinstated the glossiness of the instrument faces, adding a drop of gloss varnish in each of the depressions. And that's how the instrument panel looks straight out of the box. On painted details, when there are no structural strength requirements, I like to use white glue. It gives some work time and excess can be easily removed with water. Using CI glue, I secured the new metal legs in the seat and then inserted them in the cockpit floor, without any adhesive. Then I proceeded to glue the rear bulkhead in place and superglued the seat to the bulkhead. This way I was sure that the seat is properly located in the cockpit and it will look good. After that I installed the control stick, removed the excess metal from the seat legs and proceeded to mount one of the cockpit sidewalls. Before I could install the second one, I had to install the rudder pedals as they are hanging in between the walls. Not great for in-progress pictures, but otherwise pretty good design. My experience with the instrument panel installation was that it needed some adjustments in order to fit properly in its place. Nothing major, but it had to be done. The small side panel is also not the easiest item to glue in position. With the cockpit done, I had a few miscellaneous tasks to accomplish before I could close the fuselage halves together. The way I see things, silver does not work well with light colors for paint distress. Regular graphite pencil, on the other hand, does the job wonderfully. On each fuselage half, I installed an outlet of some sort. The fit was precise and I have nothing to complain about. Same goes for the central mounting point, which is supposed to be mounted before the fuselage goes together. The kit provides a decent looking turbocharger face. I painted that detail in silver and then with some burnt iron over the charger face. Then I applied a black wash for good measure and installed the piece in place. It does not click in, so I had to hold it while the glue sets, but otherwise the fit was precise. Once again, I have to say that I really hate when I have to install such fragile details so early in the build. Nothing wrong with the installation itself, just does not work well in the long term. The tabs that locate the cockpit inside the fuselage are perfectly adequate for the job. In my experience, the cockpit is nicely centered with no obvious gaps either side. The open front deck of this kit allows to adjust and add glue to the cockpit tabs after the fuselage is closed, which is very helpful. Gluing small sections at a time, I tried and pretty much succeeded to close the halves without having misaligned panel lines or other features. Furthermore, I made sure that I have little to no step between the two parts. The alignment features are a bit small and do not provide real lock-in type of assembly, but are distributed in a meaningful way and they help a lot. The deck over the instrument panel fits snugly, but as you can see, the mating surfaces needed some fine-tuning in order to achieve acceptable fit. After I applied the glue, I had to apply some pressure until it sets. The front bulkhead mounts without major difficulties, aided by the two vents that need to slot into the fuselage. It is possible to get an unwanted step between the fuselage and the bulkhead. However, since this joint is also a panel line, this step can go unnoticed. Moreover, in close position, the cowl flaps will mostly cover the joint, so even less to worry about. The rudder is made of two parts, one big and one small. On the small part, there was a draft angle on one of the mating surfaces, which was pushing the part a bit in front of the other part. Also, the draft angle made for a pretty wide panel line, so I sanded it down until I got the fit I wanted. The rudder fits the tail pretty nicely, but the small actuators at the bottom need care because they can easily be damaged. Moving on to the engine compartment. Here we have most of the detail dedicated to the front engine case, which makes sense because it is the most visible part of the whole deal. On other variants of this kit, there is an option to display the engine with some open panels, so they contain more engine related details. Another item that is very nicely represented is the air intake that goes underneath the engine. The assembly leaves some seams to be cleaned up, but I decided that they are not going to be visible and left them alone. My limited research showed that the interior surface of the engine cowling was some sort of anodized aluminum, so I painted that with flat aluminum. For the engine cylinders, I chose dark aluminum. The front engine case and the crankcase received a coat of ocean grey paint. With the painting done, I started the weathering with a black panel line accent color on the cylinders. I think here black is appropriate, which is rarely the case elsewhere. For the front engine case, I used the Starship wash mixture. On the cowling panels, I stippled the oil wash to create a coat of grime unevenly covering the entire surface. After the oil paint had some time to cure, I removed some of it with a Q-tip using a downward motion to get a streaky looking surface. On the front case and the cylinders, I used a brush to remove the excess wash. On the cylinders, I decided to remove the wash only from the front area. In my mind, this creates more three-dimensional effect, making the details darker further into the engine you go. To create highlights, I used white oil paint which I applied on the details using the dry brushing technique. And for the final weathering step, I did some paint distressing with a very dark grey watercolor pencil. The engine assembly is quite straightforward. First I put the two cylinder rolls together and then attached the push rods. Those I should have painted, but I forgot. They also need some massaging to click in place. Unfortunately, the brace does not have a secure fit and moves about quite a lot, so it has to be held in place while the glue sets. To all that I added the rear bulkhead and the front engine case. Both needed some force to get into position. And that's the engine done. It would have benefited from some ignition wires, but let's stick to the out-of-the-box format. The engine cowling is divided into 4 separate pieces. I have no idea why is that, but I would have a single piece cowling any day of the week. In any case, the assembly aid provided is sufficient enough and I was able to position each piece correctly. The only modification I had to do was on the bottom, where I removed some material from the engine brace. It may be a user error. I don't know why it happened like that, but be aware when you are building yours. The kit offers a choice between opened and closed cowl flaps, but since there is nothing to see behind the flaps other than empty space, I decided to mount the closed ones. The vents behind the cockpit also can be assembled in opened or closed position. Here I chose to display them opened. The vent doors fit perfectly in their places and that's about it. As you can probably see, at this point I have already had the antenna broken. So I would advise you to find a way to mount it later or cut it at the base and install it at the end of the build. To get the wings together, I started by assembling the flaps. The levers that move the flaps come as separate details. Although the ailerons and the flaps are individual details, it is not possible to mount them in any other than the neutral position without modifications, at least not in this version of the kit. The inserts that finish the gear bay openings I had to modify slightly, taking a small amount of the plastic from the corners. Also, I recommend following the instructions and installing the inserts before assembling the wings. I did not do that on one of the wings and the results were gaps that I had to handle. On the other wing, the fit was perfect after I took the corners off. And here we go again, mounting another thing that will break down the road. Anyhow, one must not forget to drill the mounting holes for the payload, if you desire to have something mounted under the wing, that is. The actual wings assembly went quite well. I had to wiggle the two parts a bit to find the correct spot, but after that it was simple glue application and some squeezing. On one of the wings there is another insert. I did the same as before, taking a piece of the corners off. In order to glue the wings to the fuselage with minimal gap in between them, I sanded the protruding gear bay walls a little bit at a time and dry fitting to see the result. After I was happy with it, I committed to the glue. As you can imagine, how the gear bays are assembled plays significant part in the wings to fuselage fit. The horizontal stabilizers fit more or less snugly in place without any adjustments. I decided to pose the control surfaces slightly dropped just to make things more interesting. After I checked the alignment, I had one more piece to add to the airframe. A small vent looking insert on the bottom, which under no circumstances should be allowed to drop inside the model at this point. I left the airframe to rest for a while and tackled other bits and pieces, like the bay doors. I chose to use the weighted wheels, which is always a nice option to have. After I assembled the halves together, I applied a layer of black primer for visualization and sanded down the seam. To restore the thread pattern, I used a fine saw from Tamiya. When the threads were done, I sanded them a little bit to remove any roughness and cleaned them up with plastic cement. The gear legs required mostly a good cleanup. The only thing to attach to them at this point were the scissors. The bazookas come in two main pieces, splitting them in half lengthwise. There are some ejector marks to clean up. Also, because the fit is quite tight, I employed clamps. The front fascia did not want to fit at all, so I enlarged the hose and voila, it fits. The rear end did not have such an issue. For the underbody fuel tank I decided to have this one, but there are other options to choose from. The tank needed some persuasion to close together, almost if it was warped. Clamps to the rescue once again. The instructions say that we should not install bazookas together with fuel tanks, so I decided I want bazookas and bombs, which I guess is much safer. The bombs are well made with their integrated mounting points. The two-piece fins once assembled look very well too, and in scale as well. Now, I will not consider this scratch building, as it is done using a brush, so it's more like painting. I wanted to test this technique and the bombs were perfect candidates. Using Tamiya's basic type putty diluted in acetone and the aforementioned brush, I stippled on a rough casting texture. The bomb pylons also have excellent surface details, and the halves fit together well. The removal of the sway braces details from the sprues has to be done very carefully, because it is possible to cut the mounting peg off. While the rear braces slot in position nicely, the front does not fit. I did some material removing and got it to fit, but maybe it will be easier before the halves are joined together. The next task was to mask the windshield and the canopy. The kit does not provide pre-cut masks, so I made my own, tracing the inner edges of the window frames. The cutting I did on a 2-axis cutting machine, but that can be done by hand as well. On the canopy I took more traditional approach using thin strips of masking tape to outline the frame and then filled the rest of the canopy with larger pieces of tape. That I did inside and out. After the masking was done, I had to address the windshield to fuselage fit, which was far from great. I removed material, test fitted, removed more material, test fitted again, rinse and repeat until satisfactory results were achieved. Finally, I could apply the interior color on the canopy frames. To clean up some molding imperfections and my own assembly shortcomings, I first applied black gap coat, which makes it much easier for me to see what I am doing. Most of the seam lines in front of the cockpit I managed to dial down using only sanding. After the seams were sorted, I had to reinstate some fastener and panel line details, but I think I got it alright. On the seam where the fuselage halves meet, I applied some diluted Tamiya basic type putty, and one application was enough. The gun sight I had to install very carefully, but once it was securely in place, I could mount the windshield and glue it in. The work laid down earlier on really paid off now. In my books, painting starts with primer. A layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 grey primer lays a great foundation for the camouflage. After I was done with the top and then turned the model upside down to deal with the belly. Do you remember the small actuators in the gear base I told you about earlier on? Well, those broke, to no one's surprise, I may add. However, this was a blessing in disguise. The kit provides a gear up option where the gear bay doors come in one piece. In the absence of the actuators, I used those gear up parts as masks. To fix them in position, I used masking fluid. After the fluid cured, I pushed the excess over the mask, and that I count as the easiest gear bay masking option. In this build I am not going to use black basing or marbling. Instead, I am going to revisit a technique I haven't used since the days of my Hellcat build, but more on that later. As hard as it is to see, I applied insignia white on the underside of the wings and on the belly for the invasion stripes, and on the tail and the stabilizers for some other markings suggested by the instructions. I was honestly surprised to see that there are no decals provided, especially for the markings on the tail. One would expect to have some. After I masked off the white lines, I applied Tamiya's rubber black for the black lines. Then I outlined the white strips on the stabilizers and painted the gear bay doors. In the description I will link a tutorial I made on how to mask invasion stripes in case you are interested. After the black was applied, I switched to very diluted insignia white and highlighted some panels and in between the rivet rows. All of that to break the monotonous surface. On the horizontal stabilizers, I masked the black outlines with thin strips of masking tape. With that done, it was time to apply the camouflage colors. Allegedly, those airplanes were originally delivered in the UK in natural metal finish. After D-Day, in order to be stationed on airfields on the continent, they were painted in camouflage with paints that Brits had available. From what I could find, the belly was RAF medium sea grey, so that's what I painted on. First, I applied an overall coat of the paint without any effects, just good coverage. At this point I remembered that I need to glue the wingtip lights on. They come with small indentations representing the actual light fixtures. Those I filled with green and red translucent paints, and after the paints were dry I removed the excess. The cutouts in the wings needed some adjustment in order to get the light housings as flush as possible. Those pieces are quite fiddly to mount on the wings, but it's doable. Back on the camouflage. Using highly diluted rubber black paint, I traced all panel lines. Then I switched to highly diluted insignia white and traced all rivet rows, highlighted some small panels and did some marbling on larger panels that had no rivets. This might look a bit too much, but stay with me. I diluted the base color quite a lot and started applying thin layers. Layer after layer I was checking the state of the coverage under different lighting conditions until I was happy with the opacity of the base color and the visibility of the underlying effects. While we are all enjoying some masking removal, I want to say thank you to all my channel members and Patreons for their continuous support. You guys are awesome. I wanted to step out of my comfort zone and airbrush the demarcation lines freehand. With a few exceptions, I think I did a good job, especially when I look the model with my own eyes instead of zoomed in pictures or on video. I cannot tell you the exact thinning ratio of the paint and the air pressure as I was adjusting those on the fly. What I can tell you is that the Mr. Rapid Thinner helps a lot, and also it is very good to have something to rest your wrist on. Trying to keep your hand in the air and do delicate airbrushing at the same time puts quite a lot of strain, and my hand was starting to shake. When I got my wrist comfortable, that was no longer an issue. After the demarcation lines were done, I applied the base color. The top of the aircraft was painted in the color that the Brits had closest to the US olive drop at the time. This, according to my research, was RAF dark green. Here I did not go for the full opacity of the color because it is quite dark, and later I will have to be heavier with the intershading, which will call for heavier blending layer. The intershading layer was applied just like the one on the underside. Well diluted rubber black along the panel lines and well diluted insignia white along the rivet rows, highlights on small panels and marbling larger panels that have no rivets. Here I failed to notice that the cowl flaps have to be painted in the camouflage color, so I came back later and painted them too. After the base color blend coats were applied, I left the model to cure overnight and came back with some lacquer-based gauze varnish to protect the paint and also to have easier time when I applied the decals. The varnish I left alone for a while, and in the meantime I did some other bits and pieces. The rims I painted in a color that I cannot recall anymore. What is more interesting, the Edward masks for the F4 Phantom wheels are perfect match. Additionally, I made masks for the covers and painted those in insignia red. The tires I painted with rubber black, which is kind of an obvious choice. For the gear legs color, as far as I know, there are different options. I chose to paint them in olive drop, for which I used an MRP product. The underbody fuel tank was primed with black primer. Using a grey acrylic paint with a drop of drying retarder and a lot of thinner, I applied some sort of marbling over the black primer using a sponge. After that effect was dry, I applied several blending layers of neutral grey paint. This color is slightly different than the camo color on the belly, and I made that on purpose, with the purpose being, well, to be slightly different. On the bazookas and the bombs I tried something. I applied white oil paint over the black primer using the dry brushing technique. This looked promising as a way to exaggerate shadows and highlights, but after I applied the olive drop, the effect became invisible. Maybe the oil paint needed to cure further and was dissolved by the lacquer paint. To paint the yellow tips on the bombs, I cut out circles from a piece of tape, and the remainder of the tape I carefully applied on the bombs. After the paint application, I removed the masks and brush painted the small propeller looking things with polished metal acrylic paint. I was too lazy to mask for the yellow strips by the fins of the bumps and chose to brush paint them instead. Not very proud of the result, but it is not bad either. The interior of the gear bay doors was painted in the same yellow color as the gear base, apart from two small panels which I painted with dark aluminum. Then, using highly diluted black paint, I did some post shading. To bleach the flat areas, I used highly diluted buff paint. Around the surface details, I applied Starship Field oil paint wash, which I later carefully removed using a brush. To introduce some highlights, I dry brushed white oil paint on the edges. Last, I did paint distress using very dark grey, or rather ivory black watercolor pencil. There will be two more weathering steps here, but that will come a bit later. For now, I think they look good. For the propeller, I started with dark aluminum on the dome. After that was dry, I masked it off and painted the blades with rubber black. Using highly diluted gold grey, I added some randomly spaced streaks perpendicular to the blades. Next, I assembled the two propeller halves, which was pretty straightforward. To paint the yellow tips, first I cut a piece of tape that served as a spacer, and then masked off the remaining portion of the blades. Then I airbrushed the yellow paint, gave it some time to cure, and masked off the blades once again to apply flat aluminum on the hub. That unmasking and masking step was probably unnecessary. Finally, I covered the propeller blades with gloss varnish, and I was ready for decals. As I already told you earlier, the decals are made by Cartograph, which puts us in a great spot right out of the bat. For decals, they are strong, do not crack. The colors are nice, although the white is a bit translucent, but just a little bit. The decals react well to decal solutions, and what is very important to me, they work well with the Agama Strong solution. In terms of design, they are mostly well thought out, having cutouts around raised details or holes that can cause issues. The area I was most concerned about was the checkerboard on the engine cowl. There is no easy way to apply this pattern. Paint or decals, it is always going to be an interesting experience, to put it mildly. Here we have 4 decals. Each have a couple of cuts in the front to account for the curvature. I'm afraid this is not enough. Anyhow, using mild softening solution, I slowly worked the decal to take the complex surface shape, or as close as it was possible. Here heat helps, so if you have a hairdryer at hand you can use it, but just be careful not to melt anything. I did not have a hairdryer, so I used an electric space heater, which worked, but I had to be extra careful. Next, I applied the strong decal solution from Agama and left it to do its job. This chemical makes the decal so soft that it resembles paint more than a decal. As I have told you, it is important to leave it alone, because if touched while it's still soft, the decal will be damaged. Sometimes, however, there are exceptions to this rule. For instance, trapped air can create small bubbles, so I had to pop them. In some cases it went well, without damage, while on other spots, well, I had to come back and do some touch-ups. Other than that area, it was mostly smooth sailing. On the vendors behind the cockpit, the instructions suggested a decal shape that was not really present on the sheet. Fortunately, there were enough other unused decals so I could make it up. Or maybe I did something wrong. The stencil's decal sheet has a cool feature, which I haven't seen anywhere else. The stencils are grouped in accordance to the way they appear in the instructions, top view, left view, etc. I find this very helpful. I also have to say that the bombs benefit greatly from the stencils. It took me 2 days to apply the decals, but at the end I think it all looks very well, especially the checkerboard. Honestly, I did not have high expectations about it in the beginning. At this point it was time to start the weathering, or rather continue it. Using the familiar, very well diluted black paint, I did some post shading on the decals and the white markings. What this should do is integrate them better with the overall feel of the model. Next up, I started playing with oils. Not necessarily in the weathering aspect, but more so in the painting. Using a neutral grey oil paint, I highlighted one corner of almost all panels, and with Starship Field I shadowed the opposite corner. I tried to blend the oil paint to the point where there is a perfect transition from the airbrushed paint. Did not achieve that level of blending, but close enough. All this is done to help separate the panels a little bit, because I intend to go light with the panel line wash. This approach creates a very interesting combination where highlighted corner may meet non-treated part or a shadowed corner of other panel. And all possible combinations of having 3 variables creates something that I really like. After a few layers of gloss varnish, the previously applied oil effects are mostly gone. To be fair, the grey oil paint did not feel 100% cured. Even after its overnight rest, the Starship Field remained visible. It was from the oil brusher range, while the neutral grey was regular oil paint from Uptailung, so I guess the oil brusher cures much faster. In any case, this technique I will explore further in some other build. After the gloss coat, I diluted the Starship Field oil paint to a wash consistency with white spirit and applied the wash top to bottom, all over the place. When the surface turned matte, I removed the excess with paper towel, along the airflow on the wings and perpendicular to the ground on the vertical surfaces. Honestly, there is not much more to it. I only had to force the wash into some of the rivets, in places successfully, not so much in others. The next step was to apply an overall coat of semi-matte varnish. I was contemplating whether to use straight flat or this, because straight flat will be better for the watercolor pencils, but I did not want to have a dead flat finish as the final appearance of the model. Also, I know that most of the pencil weathering will be destroyed if I apply a lacquer semi-matte over it, so I decided to apply the semi-matte and be done with it, with hope that the pencils will stick. Speaking of which, watercolor pencils are truly amazing for scuffs and scratches, despite the fact that I don't have the best possible surface underneath them. Mind you, things look much better in person. The close-up shows things that cannot be seen in real life. I focus my efforts on high traffic areas like the path that the pilot takes to climb into the cockpit, or the areas where the ground crew is most likely to walk or perform tasks. For instance, I scratched the area surrounding the ammo belt and gun bays. The panels covering those bays I left undamaged because while the ammo is fed into the guns, the panels are opened and out of harm's way. As you can see, I am switching between the colors, applying the effects as I see fit. The propeller is also a very good example to showcase the power of watercolor pencils. Here I used only 2 colors, silver and grey. With the silver I simulated bare metal on the leading edge and some short scratches after it. On the rest of the blades I applied scuffs with the grey pencil. Very easy, and the results are just as convincing. And yes, I forgot about the ivory black scratches on the yellow tips. For a little bit of dusting I first used dry light matte acrylic paint. The dust I tried to keep at minimum, just as a hint of environmental weathering, mainly on the wing roots, around the gear bay area and the tail. I added some weathered wood color to the base dry light matte color. With that, my application was tighter, focusing mainly on the panel lines and closer to the gear base. Essentially, I tried to represent the richness of color that dust accumulations get the bigger they become. When dusting, one must not forget about the wheels and other bits that come close to the ground and attract all sorts of dust and grime. Oil streaks and general grime were applied on the belly in addition to the pencil-made streaks I did earlier. As it goes with oils, now I had to leave them alone to cure. For some last bits of weathering we have the exhaust and heat stains, all created using Tamiya smoke diluted with rapid thinner. One thing I dislike about this paint is that it is glossy, and I find that to be an issue, especially where I try to replicate gun stains. So I applied flat varnish almost everywhere except near the exhaust, because oil gets out with the exhaust and that leaves shiny finish. As you can probably see, I tried to be restrained. This is kind of the ethos of the build. Less is more. To start the final assembly, I installed the landing gear. Here it is of a great importance how the gear bays were assembled long time ago. Any deviation from the intended positions of the sidewalls and the top means screwed up geometry. Furthermore, the instructions carry no images that can help with the visualization of this geometry. So I tried to get the gear legs to be glued in the same way, so if they are not correct, they will at least be the same. I also dealt with the recognition lights and the landing light. The lens on the latter had too big diameter to fit, and I had to sand it down. Inevitably, I scratched the clear plastic with the sandpaper, so I decided to give it a quick sand down with 3000 sanding sponge and call this a wear effect. The gear bay doors went on without too much hassle. Everything is well thought out and actually made to fit. I only had to struggle a little bit with the tailwheel gear bay doors. There was no way to lock them in place, so I had to keep them that way manually. Another thing that I did was to reinstall the broken actuator rods and painted them with silver paint. The rocket launchers, pylons, bombs and the fuel tank also took their places without a fight. The wheels though, for starters, when you have weighted wheels, it's nice to have a register of sorts, to show you the correct orientation. With today's CAD design kits, I don't think it is difficult for the engineers to put such helper in place. Then there is the fit of the wheels on the shafts, not really confidence inspiring. The icing on the cake goes to the tail wheel, which is a joke to be honest. Not only that the shaft is way too small, but the gear leg is super flimsy. The propeller to engine assembly also offers a lot to be desired. The canopy fits with no problems though. Well, it is a shame that the final bits of this build leave a bit of a bad taste in the mouth. I sincerely hope that MiniArt will watch this video and will take it for what it is. I intend my criticism as to be a constructive one. Despite its few shortcomings, this was a very enjoyable kit to build, with great surface details and decent fit, and it should not be let down by such small things. Once again, I strongly encourage you to leave a comment and tell me what do you think about this format. I have thick skin and do not get offended easily, so fire away. In any case, thank you very much for watching until the end. You are a legend. Until next time, happy modeling, fellas.